Hello friends, welcome back to part 12 of my 2022 Q3 Tesla earnings forecast review series. Let's get right back to where I left off in the previous video because I forgot to mention something that I really should have. I got to total revenue and thought that I was done, but below the total revenue line is where I show the total regulatory credits revenue that I'm expecting to materialize in each quarter. How am I forecasting this? Well, this is just a link to the total revenue at the bottom, so we'll get to that later. It's actually coming from this assumption that the regulatory credits revenue per vehicle will decline by this percentage year over year. So I've got huge declines in regulatory credits revenue on a per vehicle basis going forward, in line with what Zach has said about how regulatory credits will become a less and less important piece of Tesla's P&L moving forward, and that eventually it'll go away. Well, if I want it to eventually go away, I really need to forecast it down a lot. But you can see that in Q1, I had to change this assumption to down only 8% because the regulatory credits Tesla reported that quarter were so large. $678 million is the most regulatory credits revenue Tesla has ever reported in total, even though it was down 8% year over year on a per vehicle basis. Tesla sold a lot more vehicles in Q1 of 2022 than they did the year before, right? So that's how this is working, and so if I scroll up to row 257, I probably should have copied, or I probably should have gone into more detail on this earlier as I scroll up the page, trying not to miss it. So this is my forecast for Fremont Model 3 regulatory credits revenue per vehicle. We're still talking about revenue for right now. So what I'm taking is the average of the year before and the year before that. So $2,874 was the actual revenue per vehicle in Q3 of 2021. It was way higher the year before, right? So there's a bunch of different ways you could do this. This is how I'm doing it. I'm taking that average and I'm multiplying it by 1 plus that percentage. So 1 plus a negative 80% means I'm only taking 20% of it, right? So that's what's happening. That gets me my average regulatory credits per vehicle, and then all the other lines just reference this same cell to say, hey, we've already decided that on average worldwide it's going to be 365. The regulatory credits are different in different regions. Some vehicles qualify, some don't. So I have taken the expedient route of just saying, hey, what do we think it'll be on average for all global deliveries? And then I'll just show that reflected for every model because it's easier to get it to work that way. And it doesn't really matter that much anyhow, right? You're ultimately just trying to figure out, hey, how much of the revenue is regulatory credits? So I've got $1.8 billion worth of regulatory credits in for this year. And then another 1.8 billion next year, even though the volume of deliveries will be a lot higher next year. All right, so that concludes the FCAU regulatory credit sales is just some math that I had to calculate in here for an agreement for European vehicles that Fiat Chrysler had with Tesla to buy regulatory credits, that I'm not going to get into in more detail. So the next major section of my model is what we're going to spend most of our time talking about in this video, and that is cost of sales. How do I know how much cost of sales to forecast hitting Tesla's income statement? This is a really important component of figuring out what the automotive gross margin is going to be, right? Well, if you recognize the format, it's exactly the same as the revenue detail section was. For every option, I'm going to take the same methodological approach to determining, okay, what was the option take rate and what was the cost per option, or based on what I've already forecast for the revenue for this option, for this model, for this site, what cost of sales percentage do I think is applicable here? Or if I feel pretty good about the cost that I had in a previous quarter, and what I would like to forecast is how much I expect that to change going forward based on what I know about what's happening now versus what was happening then, I could just apply a growth rate to the cost that I've got already tied out for what Tesla reported in previous quarters. So those are the forecasting approaches you'll see used in this section. So here we've got that last one that I just referred to. Okay, in Q2, we feel like those costs have been growing this year, higher than they were previously for the base config Fremont Model S. If you chase it back far enough, you'll get to the pre-plaid costs. So back here, if I chase it back far enough, okay, so way back in Q1 of 2020, I was forecasting the Model S as, all right, it's probably a 22% gross margin vehicle, so at an $80,000 price point, that would make it $62,400-ish. Pre-plaid, right? And these were the numbers that I was tying out against what Tesla reported, so you had to kind of eyeball each model and figure out, okay, what makes sense for the mix of vehicles that we know Tesla reported. So I had that getting cheaper over the next few quarters before the plaid refresh happened, and the cost went way up, right? Because the volumes were so much lower. So I had that up 33% from the previous quarter up to 84 grand, which I thought looked about right at the time. Then I brought that down 12% from there to 74 grand, 73. And then it's been up since with the recent inflationary cost pressures we've seen for Tesla, 75, 76, 77. And then going forward, I've got that stabilizing and coming back down as Tesla irons out the ramp at scale for this vehicle. So for the other items in the detail, I've just got assumptions. So like for paint, you can see that's very stable at about 700. Here's a different approach for the performance package option. For this one, you really want to make sure you've got a reasonable cost of sales percentage on this. Tesla wants people to buy the performance package because it makes every sale more profitable when they do, so we should expect the cost of sales percentage to be something like this. 56%, 54%, 53%, 50% is what I've got here for the performance package. Should be a very profitable, lucrative option for Tesla every time somebody takes that. Then with the wheels, I've got a 45% cost of sales assumption in for that, dropping to 40% next year. Then for the interior options, if you want the alternative interiors, those shouldn't cost a lot more than the base interior costs. So I've got a 28% or a 25% cost of sales assumption on that. And full self-driving, you could assume zero for, but I assume $100 worth of average cost per vehicle on this, because Tesla does spend money on full self-driving. And I wanted to account for that someplace against products that have revenue, just to match that cost with the revenues it drives, because I feel better about that from an accounting standpoint. And the rest of these are just basic assumptions. Hey, there's going to be some cost for destination and delivery, regulatory credits, and other. The regulatory credits, you could assume zero. I've got $5 per vehicle in here for cost. Maybe there's some paperwork or administrative costs that have to come with those. And for each of these models, we're showing how much the cost of sales dollars for that model are. So about $1 billion per quarter is what I have in my forecast for Fremont Model S's. Then for the Fremont Model X's, same kind of idea here, with these costs coming down rapidly from where they were when This came out of refresh in Q3 of 2021 at an absurdly high cost per vehicle because they delivered so few of them back then. So it's been coming down, down, down since then in my forecast model, and will continue to as the volume of Model X's out of Fremont continues to ramp. Then similar assumptions to the Model S everywhere else. I'll keep moving and try to focus only on things that are different as we move on, so I'm not just repeating myself 12 times or however many times. Fremont Model 3's way less cost per vehicle on this than for the Model S or X. They're at a higher volume. You get more of them produced per shift, right? The labor cost per vehicle ought to be a lot lower. The cost of paint and performance package ought to be a lot lower on these. Those sorts of assumptions are what go into this really pretty stable cost that I'm forecasting for the cash buyer cost of sales on Model 3. Remember this later when we get to the cost of sales percent section and you see a lot of gross margin improvement, cost of sales percent improvement over time. It is not my forecast being too aggressive about what the cost of sales per delivery ought to be. I think I've got pretty reasonable assumptions in here for that. Fremont Model Y, also with costs around 40 grand, 42 grand once you get to the bottom line with these other costs in here. That's the Fremont Model Y. I'll skip Roadster. We get to Shanghai. Here's the Shanghai Model Y. Much lower costs per vehicle here than you see in California, much lower labor costs in China, a lot of locally sourced parts at favorable costs per vehicle in China. So you see just lower costs across the board. That's the factory where you want to do most of your production for export, which is what Tesla does when they can. Next we have the Shanghai Model Y here. These costs may not be any higher at all than they are for the Model 3, so they are producing these at greater scale, greater volume. So if they are producing more of them per shift, that ought to be helpful and offset the additional materials cost for producing a slightly larger vehicle, midsize crossover SUV. So next we go through to the Berlin section to find the Berlin Model Y, and here you see a more dramatic paring down of cost over time as Tesla is going to be producing more of these. The costs per vehicle ought to be coming down. So what are these based on? They're based on what the Fremont Model Y's costs are. So I had 50% premium over Fremont's cost per vehicle here. 48% here, 30%, 20%, 12%, 6%, etc. So that's what's going on here. Next, you see the other costs. So mostly what's driving down the total cost per vehicle is this base config per vehicle, right? A very similar story once we get to the Texas Model Y, with these costs doing the same thing. Relative to Fremont that quarter, how expensive are these vehicles to produce? And my assumption is that by the end of next year, both Texas and Berlin will be producing these vehicles more profitably on a per vehicle basis than Fremont does today, so improving Tesla's gross margin by the end of next year. Next we have Cybertruck. I'm going to need to scroll out and include 2024 to show you this ramping down. Little Easter egg for you here in Q2 when the volume of Cybertrucks delivered could be 0, but I'm forecasting it so low that even at these high costs you're only looking at like 32 million, or as Tesla would report the number, $0.032 billion. Ramping up to a pretty decent cost by the end of next year, 1.6 billion almost, and then climbing after that into profitability in 2024, really starting to contribute. Semi, we'll start to see getting delivered at the end of this year at an insanely high cost per vehicle. $1 million per semi is what I have in my forecast, which only amounts to 8 million if you only sell 8 of them, right? So that's what's going on there. And then those costs coming up slightly over time as we move forward. Then that's it. So we just total up the cost of sales below that for cash buyers and for leased buyers and for the total. And then we have the energy section down here where we forecast using reasonable cost of sales percentages for each energy product, how much money we expect to be left over after paying for the costs direct to those. I have a very complex formula in here for services and other cost of sales, but it just says let's look at what's been getting reported and improve upon that over time as we hit scale. Then there's the total cost of sales dollars here, and cost of sales percentages and gross margins, which is just 1 minus the cost of sales percent. And that takes us to the end of the cost dollars section. So I will say, if you've enjoyed today's video, click the like button, and if you're not subscribed to my channel, you could go ahead and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in part 13.